Imagine a machine so powerful it could move a nation, yet so fragile it was destroyed by a single idea. In the early 20th century, if you stood in the heart of Eddystone, Pennsylvania, the ground beneath your feet didn't just vibrate, it roared. This was the kingdom of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, a 600-acre empire of fire, steel, and blood, where 20,000 men labored day and night to forge the iron titans that conquered the American wilderness. They were the undisputed kings. They built over 70,000 locomotives. Their name was synonymous with American progress. If you saw a train in 1920, chances are it carried the Baldwin plate. They were too big to fail. But today, if you visit that same spot in Pennsylvania, there is nothing but silence. The fires are out. The colossal walls have crumbled. The giant that ruled the world didn't just go out of business. It collapsed in a dark spiral of corporate arrogance, technological denial, and a series of cursed designs that many believe were doomed before they ever hit the tracks. How does the world's greatest manufacturer vanish from the face of the earth? Why did they ignore the very invention that would eventually murder them? And what was the dark secret hidden inside their final desperate machines? Tonight, we step into the smoke and the shadows to uncover the rise and the brutal, agonizing fall of the steam giant. This is the dark story of the Baldwin Locomotive Factory. The story doesn't start with a tycoon, it starts with a jeweler. Matthias Baldwin was a man of precision. He spent his days handling tiny gears, delicate springs, and precious metals in Philadelphia. He was a whitesmith, a master of fine tools. But Matthias had a restless mind. In 1825, he grew bored of watches and trinkets. He wanted to build something that breathed. At the time, steam was the dark magic of the age. Most people thought it was a passing fad, a dangerous toy, but Matthias saw the future. In 1831, a local museum asked him to build a miniature locomotive to show people how this steam stuff worked. It was a toy, a curiosity. But when Matthias finished it, the toy pulled 4 cars full of passengers around a circular track. The crowd went wild. Suddenly, the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad came knocking. They didn't want a toy. They wanted a beast. Matthias had never seen a full-sized locomotive up close, except for one imported from England that was sitting in crates. He studied it like a surgeon. With nothing but hand tools and a chisel fixed to a block of wood, he began to forge his first masterpiece, Old Ironsides. It was a miracle of wood and iron. It weighed 5 tons. It could hit 28 miles per hour, a terrifying speed for 1832. But here is where the dark undertones begin. The railroad owners were cheap. They tried to stiff Matthias on the bill, claiming the engine didn't perform. Matthias, a man of pride, almost walked away from locomotives forever. He famously said, "This is our last locomotive." If he had kept that promise, history would be different, but he didn't. He doubled down. He became obsessed. And that obsession built a factory that would eventually consume 20,000 lives a day. By the 1840s, the Panic of 1837 had nearly wiped Matthias out. He was drowning in debt. But instead of folding, he did something radical. He offered his creditors a deal. Wait for your money, and I will give you a world-class engine. He survived, and then he thrived. By the time the Civil War broke out, Baldwin wasn't just a shop, it was the arsenal of the Union. His locomotives moved the troops that saved the country. When Matthias died in 1866, he left behind a company that was no longer just a business, it was a national monument. But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, the scale of Baldwin's ambition became monstrous. They moved from the cramped streets of Philadelphia to Eddystone. This place was a city unto itself. It had its own police force, its own fire department, and its own docks. They could turn raw ore into a finished steaming locomotive in a matter of weeks. They were shipping engines to Russia, Brazil, China, and Africa. At its peak, a new Baldwin locomotive rolled out of the shop every 14 hours. But inside this success, a rot was starting to grow. It's a rot common to kings: arrogance. The leaders at Baldwin began to believe because they perfected the steam engine was the only thing that mattered. They looked at a new, quiet technology emerging in the distance, the diesel engine, and they laughed. It was the laugh that would eventually lead to their execution.
By 1914, the world was on fire. World War I wasn't just a war of soldiers, it was a war of logistics. And logistics meant trains. The British, the French, and eventually the Americans all turned their eyes toward one place: Eddystone, Pennsylvania. Baldwin didn't just build locomotives anymore, they became a titan of munitions. They realized that their massive steel presses, used to forge locomotive boilers, could just as easily forge shells. Within months, the Baldwin campus was transformed into the arsenal of the Allies. They built a sprawling plant for the Remington Arms Company right on their grounds. At its height, Baldwin and its subsidiaries were producing half of all the rifles used by the British and American forces. But there was a dark side to this sudden explosive growth. On April 10, 1917, at 9:55 a.m., the Eddystone Ammunition Corporation plant, a Baldwin subsidiary, literally blew apart. An explosion in the shrapnel building ripped through the factory. 133 people, mostly young women and girls working the assembly lines, were vaporized or crushed. It was one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. Sabotage by German spies was suspected, though never proven. But did Baldwin stop? No. The fires were relit before the smoke even cleared. The demand for steam was too high. The profits were too intoxicating. Baldwin was now a monster that had to be fed with more steel, more coal, and more blood. After the war, Baldwin sat on a mountain of cash. They decided to consolidate everything. They abandoned their original Philadelphia shops and moved every single hammer and lathe to the massive Eddystone plant. This was their golden trap. You see, a factory that spans 600 acres is a marvel when orders are high, but it is a ticking bomb when orders stop. The property taxes, the heating, the maintenance of miles of internal track, the overhead was astronomical. And then the 1920s arrived. The Roaring '20s felt like a victory lap for Baldwin. They were building the Prosperity Special, a massive train of 20 oil-burning locomotives delivered across the country in a single, high-profile PR stunt. Samuel Vauquelin, the president of Baldwin, was a steam evangelist. He was a tall, imposing man who believed that the steam engine was the pinnacle of human achievement. To him, the steam engine was a living, breathing creature. But while Vauquelin was celebrating his Prosperity Special, a quiet, boxy, unglamorous machine was being tested in a small shop in New York. It didn't puff white smoke, it didn't hiss, it just hummed. It was the diesel electric locomotive. In 1925, the Central Railroad of New Jersey bought the first commercially successful diesel locomotive. It was built by a coalition including GE and Ingersoll Rand. The diesel was superior in every way that mattered to a business. It didn't need hours to fire up, it didn't need massive water towers every 50 miles. It was 30% more efficient. But when reporters asked Samuel Vauquelin about this new diesel threat, he laughed. He famously called it a toy. He believed that while a diesel might move a small car in a yard, it could never pull 100 cars over the Rocky Mountains. This wasn't just a business mistake, it was a theological failure. Baldwin had spent 100 years perfecting the art of steam. Their engineers were masters of thermodynamics, of valve gear, of coal combustion. To them, switching to diesel wasn't just a change in product, it was an admission that their 100-year legacy was obsolete. So, Baldwin did the one thing you should never do when a revolution is coming. They ignored it. They kept building bigger, heavier, more complex steam engines. They built the mallets, monstrous machines with 2 sets of driving wheels. They were beautiful, they were powerful, and they were dinosaurs watching a meteor fall from the sky. In October 1929, the music stopped. The Great Depression didn't just hurt Baldwin, it paralyzed them. Railroads, Baldwin's only customers, went bankrupt by the dozen. Suddenly, no one wanted a new steam engine. Baldwin's massive 600-acre Eddystone plant, the one that cost millions just to keep the lights on, became a desert. In 1926, they had built over 1,000 locomotives. In 1932, they built 7. Not 700, not 70, 7. The giant was starving, and just when they thought it couldn't get worse, their biggest competitor, a company called General Motors, decided it was time to move in for the kill. This is where the story turns from a business failure into a full-blown industrial horror story. We're entering the 1930s and 40s, where Baldwin tries to fight back against a predator they didn't see coming: General Motors.
While Baldwin was praying for the return of the golden age of steam, a shark was circling their waters. That shark was General Motors, GM. In 1930, GM bought a small company called the Winton Engine Corporation and another called Electro-Motive. They didn't care about the history of the railroad. They didn't care about the soul of a steam engine. They cared about standardization. At Baldwin, every locomotive was a custom-built piece of art. If a railroad wanted the whistle 3 inches to the left, Baldwin moved it. But GM changed the game. They told the railroads, "This is our model. It's a diesel. It's reliable. It's cheaper. Take it or leave it." In 1935, GM opened a massive plant in LaGrange, Illinois. They weren't just building engines. They were building a revolution. They marketed their locomotives like cars, sleek, colorful, and efficient. Baldwin's leadership looked at these GM diesels and called them tin cans. They believed no real railroad man would ever trust a glorified truck engine to pull a transcontinental express. It was a fatal miscalculation. While Baldwin's sales stayed at zero, GM's order books began to explode. By the late 1930s, Baldwin finally realized the water was above their heads. They were drowning. They had to build a diesel. But they had a problem. They didn't know how. Instead of starting from scratch or hiring the best electrical engineers, Baldwin tried to steamify the diesel. They built engines that were too heavy, too complex, and, most importantly, impossible to maintain. It was a 120-foot-long beast with 24 wheels. It looked like something out of a sci-fi nightmare. It was supposed to be the steam killer, but inside it was a mess of wires and leaking oil. The centipede was so complex that if one small part broke, the entire locomotive had to be dismantled. It was the Ferrari of locomotives, beautiful to look at, but it spent more time in the repair shop than on the tracks. Railroaders began to call Baldwin's new diesels the scrap metal specials. The reputation Matthias Baldwin had spent 100 years building was evaporating in a cloud of diesel smoke. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the U.S. government stepped in. The War Production Board took control of the entire American industry. They looked at the landscape and made a decision that would be the final nail in Baldwin's coffin. They told General Motors, "You build the diesels for the main lines." They told Baldwin, "You keep building steam engines for the war effort." On the surface, this looked like a win for Baldwin. They were back in their comfort zone. They were building thousands of steam engines for the military. The Eddystone plant was humming again. But it was a death sentence. While the war raged, GM was perfecting diesel technology with government funding. They were learning how to make them faster, stronger, and more reliable. Baldwin, meanwhile, was forced to stay stuck in the 19th century. When the war ended in 1945, Baldwin looked around and realized the world had moved on without them. Every major railroad in America was ready to retire steam forever. Baldwin was left with a factory full of 1880s technology in a 1950s world. Baldwin made one last desperate attempt to survive. They hired legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy to create the shark nose. It was stunning. It looked like it was moving 100 miles per hour while standing still. It was Baldwin's Hail Mary. But beneath the beautiful chrome skin, the engines were still failing. They were plagued by low-pressure oil issues. They were notoriously difficult to MU, meaning you couldn't easily link a Baldwin engine to a GM engine. Railroaders started returning them. Orders were canceled. The massive Edstone plant, once the pride of America, began to feel like a graveyard. The 20,000 workers were down to a few thousand. The silence in the halls was deafening. But the darkest part of the story wasn't the failure of the machines. It was what happened to the men who ran the company. As the walls closed in, they didn't just give up. They began to cannibalize themselves.
By 1950, the math was simple and brutal. Baldwin was bleeding cash. They were no longer the kings of the rail. They were a charity case for the banks. In a last-ditch effort to stay relevant, they merged with the Lima Hamilton Corporation, another legendary locomotive builder. They called the new entity Baldwin Lima Hamilton, BLH. On paper, it was a powerhouse. In reality, it was two drowning men grabbing onto each other only to sink faster. The cultures clashed. The engineering teams, still obsessed with the glory days of steam, couldn't agree on a unified diesel design. While they argued in boardrooms, General Motors and Alco were capturing 90% of the market. Baldwin's share was a pathetic sliver. The railroads had a nickname for Baldwin's final diesel attempts: orphans, because once you bought one, you were on your own. Parts were impossible to find. Reliability was a joke. The prestige of the Baldwin plate had become a punchline. In 1956, the unthinkable happened. The board of directors looked at the books and realized that every locomotive they sold was actually costing them money. The overhead of the 600-acre Eddystone plant was a noose around their necks. They made the announcement: Baldwin was quitting the locomotive business. Think about that. The company that built the engines that won the Civil War, the company that powered the Industrial Revolution, the company that was too big to fail, simply gave up. They tried to pivot. They used the Eddystone plant to build construction equipment, cranes, and industrial presses, but the soul of the company was gone. The men who had spent 40 years forging boilers didn't want to build road rollers. The fire in the belly of the giant had been extinguished. By the early 1970s, the once mighty Baldwin Lima Hamilton was sold off, broken up, and liquidated. The steam giant was officially dead. Usually, when an empire falls, it leaves behind ruins, coliseums, temples, walls. But the fall of Baldwin was so absolute that it was almost erased from the earth. The massive Eddystone plant, once a city of 20,000 workers, was demolished. Thousands of tons of steel and brick were hauled away. Today, if you visit the site, you'll find a Boeing helicopter plant and some office buildings. There is almost nothing to tell you that this was once the most important industrial site in the Western world. But the dark story of Baldwin isn't just about a factory closing. It's a warning. It's a story about the cost of arrogance. Baldwin failed because they loved their past more than they feared their future. They were so convinced of their own greatness that they stopped listening to the world. They thought the hiss of steam was the sound of eternity. They didn't realize it was just the sound of time running out. Today, only a few Baldwin locomotives remain. You can find them in museums, silent and cold. They are the ghosts of Eddystone. When you stand next to one, you feel the weight of it. You feel the 100 tons of steel, the sweat of the men who built it, and the ambition of Matthias Baldwin. It's a reminder that no matter how big you are, no matter how many nations you've built, you are only one bad decision away from becoming a ghost. The tracks still run across America. The trains still roar through the night. But the name Baldwin has faded into the smoke of history. A giant that ruled the world until the world simply outgrew it.